Hi folks, thank you for stopping by. If you found this video useful, please leave a like and consider subscribing. It takes a second and it helps me a lot. Now, let's jump into today's stories. Today, we will start off with the disappearance of Arlene Fraser, Scotland, 1998. The town of Elgin, situated in the Moray region of northeast Scotland, is a geography defined by the cold, damp climate of the North Sea coast and the specific texture of its historical structures. The air in late April 1998 was thin and chill, often carrying the pervasive, briny scent of the sea mixed with the smoky, earthy aroma of peat fires and malted barley from the nearby distilleries. It was a place where life unfolded with the predictable, constrained routine characteristic of a traditional Scottish market town. Arlene Fraser, a vibrant mother of two, lived in a semi-detached house on Smith Street. Her life, though outwardly conventional, was marked by the recent, bitter disintegration of her marriage to her husband, Nat Fraser. The atmosphere in her home was one of controlled tension, punctuated by the difficult logistics of separation and the ongoing arguments over finances and the future of their children. On the morning of Tuesday, April 28, 1998, the routine was typical. Arlene saw her children off to school. The day was overcast and cool, but bright. She was scheduled to meet with a solicitor later that morning to discuss the final stages of her divorce, a fact that introduced a sense of resolution and perhaps conflict into the day's unfolding events. She was last seen by neighbors at approximately 9:30 a.m. The silence that followed was not immediate, but creeping. When the children returned home from school that afternoon, they found the house unlocked. The television was still on in the living room, filling the space with the bright, meaningless noise of daytime programming. In the kitchen, a half-eaten breakfast remained on the counter, and Arlene's contact lenses were soaking in their solution. Her handbag, keys, and, crucially, her distinctive purple Vauxhall Astra car were all gone. The scene suggested an abrupt, unplanned departure, the abandonment of routine mid-action. The atmosphere of the home quickly shifted from domestic tranquility to a profound, unsettling stillness. Nat Fraser, who lived in nearby Macduff, arrived later that evening and reported his estranged wife missing to the Grampian police. The ensuing investigation faced an immediate geographical and forensic void. There was no struggle, no blood, and no sign of forced removal. Arlene Fraser had simply vanished from her lockdown, routine world. The early search efforts centered on the immediate geography of Elgin and the vast, sparsely populated terrain of the surrounding Moray countryside. The cold, windswept moorlands, the thick pine forests, and the hundreds of remote and used farm buildings and abandoned quarries became the focus. Helicopters tracked the rough terrain, their low, insistent drone the only sound for miles. Police and volunteers walked grid patterns through fields saturated with the scent of damp heather and the sharp, penetrating cold. The search was rendered exponentially difficult by the sheer size of the geography, a landscape designed to swallow objects and secrets whole. The first critical piece of evidence emerged 2 days later, 150 miles to the south, in the seaside town of Newburgh, Aberdeenshire. Arlene's purple Vauxhall Astra was discovered parked near her former home. It was locked, and the discovery was ambiguous. If she had left of her own accord, why had she left her personal belongings at home? If she was taken, why was the car so far away, yet so cleanly parked? Forensic examination of the vehicle was extensive, but yielded little conclusive evidence. There were no obvious signs of a struggle. However, several items of clothing were found inside, including a distinctive denim jacket that belonged to her. The most significant finding was a small trace of blood in the car, which was later identified as Arlene's. This blood spatter, minimal but present, introduced the cold reality of violence into the narrative. The investigation quickly shifted focus from a missing person case to a murder inquiry without a body. The center of the narrative turned toward the only person with a clear motive and the emotional volatility to commit such an act, Nat Fraser. The geography of the investigation now became one of human connections, surveillance, and the dissection of personal relationships. Over the next few years, The police painstakingly gathered circumstantial evidence, relying heavily on the testimony of Nat's associates and the specific geography of their movements. Crucial to the case were the statements of Hector Dick, a friend and associate of Nat, and Nat's co-conspirators, who detailed Nat's obsessive efforts to prevent the divorce and his eventual desperate attempts to solicit help in disposing of a body. The geography now included the back roads, lay-bys, and secluded patches of forest where conversations and alleged disposal plans took place. The first trial in 2003 resulted in Nat Fraser's conviction, only to be overturned on appeal due to procedural errors. The narrative of the case was forced to reset, emphasizing the enduring challenge of prosecuting a murder without the physical corpus delicti. The second trial in 2012 finally secured Nat Fraser's guilt, a conviction based almost entirely on the overwhelming circumstantial evidence of motive, behavior, and the testimony of his fractured inner circle, all pointing to a deliberate act of violence and careful disposal. Despite the conviction, the primary geographical secret remains untouched. The location of Arlene Fraser's remains. The vast, cold, indifferent landscape of the Moray region continues to hold her secret. Today, the atmosphere of Elgin is as it always was: cool, damp, and busy with the routines of life. Smith Street remains a quiet, ordinary residential road, but the geographical isolation that defined the early search still governs the final mystery. The sea air, the scent of the peat, and the vast, rolling moors have absorbed the physical evidence of the crime, providing an unbreakable sanctuary for the final truth. Arlene Fraser is a presence without a physical location, a permanent vacancy within the otherwise contained geography of northeast Scotland, a testament to a violence that was thorough enough to leave only an enduring, silent absence. Next story: the Lizzie Borden Murders, Fall River, Massachusetts, 1892. The air in Fall River, Massachusetts, in the late summer of 1892, held a heavy, coastal industrial scent. A mix of humid salt tang carried up the Taunton River, the sulfurous burn of coal smoke from the textile mills, and the faint, sweet decay of fermentation from nearby orchards. August 4th dawned, a Thursday, already thick and oppressive. At 92 2nd Street, the Borden house stood as a testament to the family's rigid, unostentatious prosperity. It was a dwelling of dark, tightly shuttered windows positioned uncomfortably close to the street, a stone's throw from the working-class tenements and the constant, dull grind of the streetcar line. The soundscape of the morning was a low, ceaseless hum, the rhythmic, high-pitched clang of a passing trolley, the distant collective sigh of the mill whistles, and within the house, only the creak of floorboards on the lower level, responding to the movements of the cook and housekeeper, Bridget Sullivan. The light filtering through the narrow side windows was muted, a pale green gold struggling to penetrate the gloom of the well-kept but claustrophobic Victorian interior. The house itself seemed to absorb sound and movement, holding the still, thick summer heat in its heavily draped, carpeted rooms. It was a space of quiet, strained tension, built up over years of shared space and unspoken financial resentments, now reaching its critical temperature. The household was a small, fixed universe. Andrew Jackson Borden, a wealthy but notoriously frugal businessman. His second wife, Abby Durfee Gray Borden, heavy-set and quiet. And his two adult daughters from his first marriage, Emma and Lizzie. Emma was away, visiting friends in Fairhaven. Lizzie, 32, remained at home. The morning had seen the family at their usual breakfast of warmed mutton and plain Johnny cakes, a meal that was itself a testament to Andrew's severe economy. Just before 9 a.m., Andrew Borden left for his routine walk downtown to attend to his properties and banks. Bridget Sullivan, after her chores, had been ill for days and retired to the backyard, where she began the arduous task of washing the downstairs windows, a thankless, heat-inducing chore that positioned her, unknowingly, outside the orbit of the events about to unfold. The only other person of note was John Morse, Abby's brother, who had stayed the night but was out making calls that morning. Around 10:30 a.m., Andrew Borden returned. He was let in by Bridget Sullivan, who then returned to her window washing. Andrew settled onto the horsehair sofa in the downstairs sitting room, a room seldom used, positioned where the muted light could barely reach. He was asleep or resting. Bridget, exhausted by the heat and the window work, went upstairs to her room for a rest. The sound of the key turning in the front door, the thud of the patriarch's body settling on the couch, and then a return to the household's suffocating quiet. The clock was moving slowly. The humidity was not breaking. Sometime around 11 a.m., the first attack occurred. The exact time remains an estimate, a blurred moment absorbed by the silence of the house. Upstairs on the floor of the guest room, Abby Borden was struck multiple times from behind with a sharp, heavy instrument. She had been tidying or making the bed. Her body fell forward, hidden from view for a critical hour. There was no struggle heard, no cry that penetrated the heavy curtains or the closed doors to reach Bridget resting in her attic room, or Lizzie, who claimed to be in the barn loft eating pears, or in the back kitchen ironing. The house had swallowed the sound entirely. Bridget Sullivan descended from the attic at about 11:10 a.m. She reported feeling the heat of the downstairs. She saw Lizzie descending the main staircase. Then, the sound that would shatter the silence of 92 2nd Street. A call from the foot of the stairs, slightly raised but oddly composed. "Maggie, come quick. Father's dead. Somebody came in and killed him." Lizzie often used the Irish language nickname Maggie for Bridget. The discovery of Andrew Borden was immediate and ghastly. He lay on the sofa, his head positioned toward the front door. He had sustained 11 blows to the front of his face and head, delivered by an instrument of great force and sharpness, likely while he slept or just as he was waking. His left eye was split. The blood, arterial and venous, had surged from the deep, crushing wounds, soaking the horsehair sofa and pooling on the patterned carpet. Bridget, after checking the body, rushed to fetch a neighbor, Alice Russell. The atmosphere of the house had changed from stifling quiet to visceral horror. The authorities arrived to find an oddly controlled scene. Lizzie was being tended to by neighbors, speaking calmly, her account of having been in the barn vague and unchanging. The discovery of Abby Borden's body upstairs added a second layer of complexity and horror. She had been dead significantly longer than her husband, perhaps by up to an hour and a half. This chronological separation was the first key forensic fact. The two murders were not a single, continuous, frantic act. They were separate, deliberate, and sequenced. The house, which had been the silent container of the crime, became the focus of intense scrutiny. The barn, the cistern, the pantry, and the stove, each corner was scoured. The investigation was immediate, relentless, and amateurish. The Fall River Police Department was not prepared for a crime of this magnitude, complexity, and social status. Critical evidence was compromised by the sheer volume of official and civilian personnel trampling through the rooms. A key piece of evidence was found days later, a light-colored, short-handled hatchet discovered by a patrolman in the basement. Its head was coated in ash and partially buried in a flower bin near the laundry area. Its handle was broken off. It was believed to be the murder weapon, washed clean of all but a faint trace of blood, which, in the rudimentary forensic science of the time, could not be definitively matched. Lizzie Borden herself became the only suspect. Her behavior was noted as inconsistent. Her calm demeanor, her burning of a blue cotton dress in the kitchen stove on August 6th, which she claimed was stained with paint, and her evolving statements to police. The motive was believed to be financial, tied to Andrew Borden's recent transfers of property to Abby's relatives, the daughter's sense of entitlement, and the general, stifling dissatisfaction within the home. The 1893 trial in New Bedford was a public spectacle, fueled by sensational press and the inherent shock of a respectable woman being accused of patricide and matricide. The prosecution presented the sequence of events, the financial context, the partial evidence of the hatchet, and the lack of any credible intruder. The defense countered by emphasizing the lack of a definite murder weapon, the absence of blood on Lizzie, and the sheer societal improbability that a well-bred woman could commit such an act. Lizzie, stoic and impassive throughout, was acquitted after only an hour and a half of jury deliberation. The jury, comprised entirely of men, found it psychologically impossible to convict her on circumstantial evidence. Lizzie Borden, now wealthy, moved with her sister Emma to a large Victorian mansion on the hill they named Maplecroft. She lived out the rest of her life in Fall River, ostracized from society, dying in 1927. The hatchet remains an object of speculation. The exact chronology of the attacks remains unsettled. The identity of the killer, while almost universally believed by the public to be Lizzie, was never legally proven. The board house at 92 2nd Street still stands. It is no longer a place of silent tension, but a museum and bed and breakfast. Yet, if one stands on the street at dawn, the coastal air still carries the distant, muted sounds of the city's industry. The windows remain close to the street, and within the darkened downstairs sitting room, the heavy summer air seems to hold a residual stillness, the quiet before the single, sharp call that broke the silence forever. The geography of the crime, the tight proximity to the city, the enclosed nature of the house, and the separation of the two bodies in space and time, is the only enduring, objective witness to the bloody, unresolved morning. Next story, the Hart family murders, Mendocino County, California, 2018. The landscape of the Pacific Northwest in the early spring is defined by a deep, dramatic palette of colors. The charcoal grays of the churning ocean, the towering emerald greens of the ancient redwoods, and the blinding white spray of the waves hitting the rugged limestone cliffs. In the month of March, the air along the Mendocino coast is perpetually cool and heavy with moisture, carrying the persistent scent of sea kelp, damp pine needles, and the electric charge of a coming storm. This stretch of Highway 1 is a labyrinth of hairpin turns and steep, vertical drops into the Pacific, a world that feels isolated from the suburban grid. The atmosphere is one of profound, natural silence, broken only by the rhythmic crashing of the tide against the sea stacks, the jagged rocks that rise like sentinels from the water. The mystery did not begin with a visible tragedy, but with a silent, domestic void in a neighborhood hundreds of miles to the north in Woodland, Washington. Jennifer and Sarah Hart lived in a tidy, multi-story home with their 6 adopted children, projecting an image of vibrant, humanitarian bliss. Their life was curated through the bright lens of social media, featuring photos of family festivals and messages of radical love and activism. However, on March 23rd, the routine rhythm of the street was breached. When a neighbor reported potential concerns for the children's welfare, the authorities arrived to find a house that was impeccably clean, yet empty. The cars were gone, the children were missing, and the sanctuary of the suburban home was revealed to have no tracks leading back. The narrative shifted to the rugged terrain of Northern California 3 days later. A passing motorist discovered an SUV resting upside down on a rocky beach at the bottom of a 100-foot cliff. The air at the site was sharp with the spray of the ocean, and the SUV appeared like a metallic anomaly against the natural stone. Initial investigators treated it as a tragic road accident, an unfortunate loss of control on the treacherous coastal road. But as the forensic recovery began, the clinical nature of the scene offered a terrifying, hidden detail. There were no skid marks on the pavement at the top of the cliff. The car had not veered or slid. It had accelerated steadily from a standstill, moving in a straight, purposeful line toward the void. The investigation moved with a clinical intensity, shifting the narrative from a road tragedy to a domestic autopsy. Detectives fanned out across the history of the family, uncovering a record of hidden friction and systemic failures that allowed a facade of perfection to cloak a reality of profound internal conflict. The files revealed a geography of movement, stops at rural gas stations and quiet parking lots as the family moved south, avoiding the lights of the major cities. The forensic toxicology reports added a layer of cold, chemical reality to the case. Several of the children had high levels of diphenhydramine in their systems, suggesting they were asleep when the car moved toward the edge. The air in the legal files grew thick with the realization that the radical love projected to the world had ended in a calculated, final detachment. The search for the remaining children continued in the churning, cold waters of the Pacific. Divers and drone teams worked under the gray, heavy skies of the California spring, sifting through the tide pools and the sea caves for fragments of lives that had been erased from the digital grid. The ocean remained a vast, blue witness, holding the secrets of the crash beneath the white foam. The investigative weight was carried by the survivors and the communities that had wanted to believe in the bright images of the family, a story that highlighted the disconnect between the curated digital image and the human reality hidden behind locked doors. Today, the cliff near Swan Creek remains a quiet, breathtaking stop along Highway 1. The redwoods still tower over the landscape, and the Pacific continues to roll in, timeless and indifferent to the history of the pavement. The house in Washington has passed to new owners, the rooms now filled with a different routine. But for those who know the story, the air near the scenic lookout carries a weight of reflective awareness, a reminder that justice is sometimes reached only through the wreckage. The 6 children, Sarah, Abigail, Jeremiah, Devontae, Hannah, and Marcus, are remembered not as statistics, but as vibrant individuals whose potential was cut short by a sanctuary that failed to protect them. The mystery has found its final, somber legal classification as a murder-suicide, yet the atmosphere of the case remains in the quiet, reflective moments of those who understand the vulnerability of the domestic space. As the evening settles over the Mendocino coast, the cliffs stand in silent vigil, watched over by a history that has left its mark on the soul of the shoreline. The waves crash steadily, the wind sighs through the pines, and the memory of the light in the windows of that Washington home remains a quiet, atmospheric registry of the truth beneath the surface. Next story, the Ratcliffe Highway Murders, London, 1811. The winter of 1811 had settled over the east end of London with a chill that was less about temperature and more about penetrating damp. Ratcliffe Highway, the central artery of the district of Wapping, ran parallel to the Thames, a winding, narrow corridor perpetually steeped in the atmospheric byproduct of the docks. The air here was a thick, multi-layered compound. The coppery stench of the river mud at low tide, the sweet-sour rot of fish guts and vegetable refuse, the acrid, tarry smoke from ship-rigging workshops, and always the overwhelming, close-quarters reek of unwashed humanity and cheap gin. Sound was omnipresent, a cacophony of maritime and mercantile life. The groan of timber against the wharves, the incessant, rattling roll of drays over cobblestones, the slurred shouts of sailors fresh from the West Indies run, and the low, collective drone emanating from the numerous, dimly lit public houses. The lighting was minimal. On the night of Saturday, December 7th, the only illumination came from the sickly yellow glare of whale oil lamps spaced far apart, casting long, oily shadows that twisted and writhed in the cold fog rising from the docks. This was not a place of quiet streets. It was a district of incessant, brutal commerce, characterized by its labyrinthine alleyways, damp cellar dwellings, and the fleeting, anonymous nature of its transient population. The very architecture, cramped, leaning, 3-story brick structures, seemed designed to conceal and confuse. It was into this relentless atmospheric density that the tragedy of the Marr family was delivered. Timothy Marr was a young linen draper, a man who had chosen to establish a shop and residence at 29 Ratcliffe Highway, near the intersection with New Gravel Lane. His space was a combined shop front and dwelling, a place of order and plain textiles surrounded by a landscape of chaos. On that night, the family was winding down. Timothy, his wife Celia, their 3-month-old son, Timothy Jr., and an apprentice named James Goff were the occupants. Shortly after 11:30 p.m., James Goff, having been out on an errand to buy oysters, returned to the shop door to find it mysteriously locked. He hammered repeatedly, but there was no answer. The heavy, commercial sounds of the street seemed to absorb his noise. Eventually, the increasing clamor attracted a neighbor, John Murray, a pawnbroker. Together, they peered through the small upper window of the shop door, seeing only the dim outline of the shop's interior. Alarmed by the silence and the locked door, Murray, who lived across the street, went around to the rear of the house. Gaining entry through the backyard and into the dwelling, Murray found an immediate and profound scene of disorder. The candle, which Marr had left burning on the shop counter, was out, but the faint glow from the back room showed the horrifying reality. The shop floor was slick with blood. The bodies of Timothy Marr, Celia Marr, and James Goff lay violently sprawled in separate areas of the ground floor, each having been brutally struck down by repeated blows to the head and face. The instrument used appeared to be heavy and blunt, crushing bone and tissue with indiscriminate force. The victims were found lying amidst the scattered inventory of the shop. A collective, panicked sound finally broke through the street's usual din as neighbors and watchmen poured into the house. In the back room, the most terrible discovery was made. The infant Timothy Jr. had also been murdered, found in his crib. All four were dead. The motive initially appeared to be robbery, as the till had been emptied of a small sum and a few watches were missing, but the extraordinary, overkill nature of the violence, applied equally to a man, a woman, a boy, and an infant, suggested a depth of rage or a deliberate campaign of extermination far beyond simple greed. The geography of the crime was key. The proximity to the docks allowed for a quick, untraceable escape via the complex network of surrounding streets and waterside warehouses. No witnesses reported seeing anyone enter or exit the premises. The watchmen, notoriously inefficient, were of no help. The focus of the investigation turned quickly toward the transient maritime population, those who lived on the margins of the law and the edges of the river. The shock of the Marr massacre had not yet subsided when, 12 days later, on December 19th, a second, equally savage attack occurred less than half a mile away, in the parish of St. George in the east. The victim this time was the Williamson family at 81 New Gravel Lane, a publican's house known as the King's Arms. The victims were John Williamson, the innkeeper, his wife Elizabeth, and their servant, Bridget Harrington. The scene, discovered by a lodger who descended to the tap room in the morning, was a near replica of the Marr murders. The bodies lay scattered across the tap room and the cellar steps, again killed by savage, blunt force trauma, augmented by slashes to the throat. The sheer consistency in the technique and the immediate proximity in both time and place solidified the terrifying realization. London was being stalked by a single, methodical killer. The dense, isolating atmosphere of the East End, which was usually a shield for criminals, was now amplifying the terror. The ensuing investigation, led by a fledgling police structure, was chaotic. Suspicion initially fell upon the lodger, and then a number of other local dock workers, but the cases remained stubbornly cold. The sense of panic grew so intense that the government took the unprecedented step of offering a substantial reward, and the newly established Bow Street Runners, the closest approximation to a professional police force, were dispatched. The primary break came not from forensic work, but from local police pressure and rumor. The focus centered on an Irish sailor named John Williams, who had been lodging near the Marr house and working as a rigger in the nearby yards. Williams was identified by several key witnesses, including the owner of the bloody mallet, a heavy wooden, spar-striking tool that was now believed to be the murder weapon. Williams had allegedly attempted to clean it and had behaved suspiciously around the time of the murders. He was taken into custody. The circumstantial evidence against Williams was compelling enough for the authorities. They believed they had found their man, a desperate sailor motivated by a combination of minor theft and inexplicable, explosive violence. Before Williams could face trial and the inevitable public execution, he took his own life in the Bridewell prison cell by hanging himself. The public, gripped by terror and desperate for closure, demanded immediate proof of Williams's guilt. The authorities, equally desperate to close the case and quell the widespread panic, declared the matter settled. To ensure the public's conviction, Williams's body was paraded through the very streets where he was accused of committing his crimes. His corpse, with a stake driven through its heart, was publicly interred at the intersection of Ratcliffe Highway and Cannon Street Road, a practice reserved for suicides and murderers meant to permanently bind the evil spirit to the earth of the crime scene. The public spectacle served its purpose. The Ratcliffe Highway murders were officially closed. Yet, doubts persisted about the swift closure and the purely circumstantial nature of the evidence against Williams. Did the police simply find a convenient, morally questionable outcast on whom to pin the city's greatest fear? The truth of the specific events, the entry, the sequence, and the motivation of the killer died with Williams. Today, Ratcliffe Highway is renamed Commercial Road, a broader, more modern thoroughfare. The King's Arms pub is long gone, and the building where the Marr family died has been substantially altered. The sounds of the docks have been replaced by the roar of traffic. But beneath the asphalt and the modern structures, the foundations of 1811 Wapping still exist. When a cold, damp fog rolls in from the river, it still carries a faint, acrid scent, the residue of a time when the narrow, shadowed streets of the East End were a perfect, terrifying atmosphere for an anonymous figure to execute 2 acts of unthinkable, total annihilation, leaving the city in a paralyzing, silent grip of fear. The silence of the dead, swallowed by the noise of the living, remains a profound mystery of the London streetscape. Next story, the Idaho student murders, Moscow, Idaho, 2022. The rolling landscape of the Palouse in late autumn is a world of soft, undulating wheat fields and deep, quiet horizons that turn a bruised purple as the sun dips behind the mountains. In the college town of Moscow, the air in mid-November is sharp, carrying the heavy scent of fallen leaves, wood smoke, and the damp, freezing breath of the coming winter. King Road was a pocket of the town defined by its vibrant student energy, a neighborhood of tiered apartment buildings and multi-story houses where the sound of muffled music and the chatter of weekend social life provided a constant, energetic soundtrack. 1122, King Road was a sanctuary of this lifestyle, a bright, expansive home where 6 friends lived a life of academic promise and shared routine. On the evening of November 12th, the atmosphere was typical of a Saturday in a college town, where the lights in the windows glowed with the amber warmth of a house in its prime. The mystery did not begin with a visible disturbance, but with a silent, heavy void that settled over the house in the pre-dawn hours of Sunday. 4 students, Kaylee, Madison, Xana, and Ethan, were asleep in their rooms, resting after a night that had been captured in small, mundane fragments of social media. A photo at a party, a video at a food truck, a routine walk home through the cold Moscow air. The investigation revealed that between 4 a.m. and 4:25 a.m., the domestic sanctuary of the house was breached by a stranger who moved through the 3 levels with a clinical, terrifying speed. The night was silent, the neighborhood asleep, and no alarm was raised as the morning sun began to catch the frost on the Palouse Hills. When the police were finally called at noon, they discovered a scene of tragic, focused violence that had occurred while the energy of the town was at its lowest ebb. The investigation was launched into a community that was suddenly fractured by a profound, pervasive sense of fear. Moscow was a town where the concept of a random, predatory threat felt entirely foreign. Yet the clinical nature of the crime suggested a perpetrator who moved with a calm, methodical detachment. Detectives from local, state, and federal agencies converged on the King Roadhouse, processing a narrative that was devoid of traditional forensic tracks. There was no signs of forced entry, no discarded weapons, and no immediate witnesses who could bridge the gap between the vibrancy of Saturday night and the silence of Sunday morning. The air in the town grew heavy with a collective, social claustrophobia. The mystery lived in the shadows of the very streets the students walked every day. The narrative of the case shifted toward the digital vigil of a modern era, sifting through millions of lines of cell tower data and grainy surveillance loops from the surrounding neighborhood. Detectives looked for a singular vehicle that moved against the rhythm of the quiet hours, a white sedan that appeared on residential cameras like a ghostly, silent landmark in the dark. The investigation moved away from the campus to the larger geography of the region, focusing on the transit between Moscow and the nearby town of Pullman, Washington. The forensic focus turned toward a singular DNA profile found on a knife sheath left at the scene, a microscopic registry of a life that did not belong in the house. The breakthrough came through the scientific power of forensic genealogy, a bridge that reached back across the months to identify a suspect who lived in the quiet, academic grid of Pullman. Brian Koberger, a doctoral student in criminology, was arrested in Pennsylvania after a cross-country transit that had been tracked by the silent, digital vigil of the FBI. This revelation transformed the mystery from a localized tragedy into a global, forensic autopsy of a calculated crime. The files of the case revealed a man who moved through the daytime world of academia while cured a secret, nocturnal obsession with the house on King Road. The human element was a jarring study in the disconnect between the image of a scholar and the clinical reality of the actions taken in the pre-dawn shadows. Today, the house on King Road has been cleared away, the site returned to a quiet, open space that offers no clue to its former silhouette. The Palouse Hills still undulate in the light, and the air still turns sharp every November, a constant presence in the North Idaho landscape. The memory of the four students is kept by a community that has learned the weight of vigilance. Moscow has reclaimed its routine, but the name of the street and the history of 2022 are etched into the stone and the soul of the region. The investigation has found its formal path through the courts, yet the atmosphere of the case remains in the quiet, reflective moments of a town that was changed by a single night. As the evening settles over the Palouse, the neighborhood sleeps with the knowledge that the truth was found in the persistence of modern science and the courage of those who refuse to let the silence remain. The wind sighs through the wheat fields, the stars come out over the mountains, and the memory of the light in the windows on King Road stays as constant as the coming winter. Next story, the Menendez brothers, Beverly Hills, California, 1989. Elm Drive was a sanctuary of Mediterranean-style villas and high-walled estates, a street where the privacy of the wealthy was a silent, cultural mandate. Jose and Kitty Menendez lived in one such mansion, a home that projected an image of high-stakes corporate success and refined domestic bliss. Inside, the rooms were filled with marble, fine art, and the quiet hum of a central air system that kept the summer heat at bay. It was a setting where the concept of chaos felt entirely foreign, filtered out by the sheer weight of prestige and the orderly conduct of the social elite. The mystery did not begin with a visible disturbance, but with a frantic 911 call in the late hours of August 20th. When the authorities arrived, they found a scene that defied the expectations of a quiet Sunday night. In the wood-paneled study, the silence of the mansion had been replaced by a scene of clinical, terrifying violence. The initial investigation focused on external narratives. Detectives looked into Jose's high-profile career in the music and film industry, searching for enemies in the boardrooms or connections to organized crime. The air in Beverly Hills grew heavy with the suspicion that a professional hit squad had breached the sanctuary of Elm Drive, leaving the neighborhood in a state of suspended, communal anxiety. The investigative process moved with the speed of an international thriller, sifting through millions of dollars in financial transactions and surveillance data. Yet, the forensic restoration of the scene offered no traces of an intruder. There were no forced entries, no discarded weapons, and no digital anomalies in the security system. The focus turned inward, toward the two sons, Lyle and Eric, whose behavior in the days following the event began to read as jarring to the investigators. They moved through the city with a sudden, lavish energy, buying expensive watches, performance cars, and designer clothing, a departure from the somber rhythm expected of grieving heirs. The narrative shifted from a corporate vendetta to a domestic autopsy, as the private friction of the Menendez household began to seep into the light. The breakthrough came through the very intimacy of the domestic space, hidden in the therapeutic relationship between a son and his psychiatrist. The confession, made in the quiet clinical confines of an office, acted as a key that unlocked a different story entirely. The files of the case were transformed into a record of a family dynamic defined by hidden pressures and existential darkness. The trial that followed in the early 1990s was a seismic cultural event, as the sanctuary of the mansion was dissected in the glare of the courtroom cameras. The brothers recounted a history of profound internal conflict, presenting a narrative of desperation that challenged the public's perception of privilege. As the years passed, the case remained a landmark in the history of the American legal system. The geography of Elm Drive changed little, yet the name Menendez became synonymous with a specific kind of tragic complexity. Detectives, sifting through the layers of the past, were looking for the boundary between a calculated ambition and a traumatic reaction, a distinction that divided juries for years. The files became a permanent registry of the fragility of the suburban dream and the capacities for secrets to grow behind the high walls of a Mediterranean villa. Today, the mansion on Elm Drive still stands, though it has passed through many hands, its history tucked behind its gated entrance. The jasmine still blooms, and the lights of Beverly Hills continue to promise a kind of curated safety that remains as attractive as ever. But for those who know the history, the air near the manor carries a weight of somber awareness, a reminder that the most profound mysteries are often the ones kept inside the rooms everyone walks past. The world is at rest. The Pacific breeze is cool and steady, and the names of Jose and Kitty stay as bright in the collective memory as the stars over the Santa Monica Mountains. The story has found its final legal resolution, yet the atmosphere of that August night lingers in the mist that sometimes rolls into the hills. The neighborhood is calm. The city moves with a collective memory that refuses to let the truth remain entirely simple. And the names Lyle and Era continue to serve as a reflection of a time when the facade of the American home was shattered from within. Next story, The Resurrection Men, Edinburgh, Scotland, 1828. The city of Edinburgh was physically split between the medieval density of the old town, where overcrowded tenements leaned precariously into narrow closes, and the geometrically ordered, neoclassical grandeur of the new town. But beneath the architectural divide lay a deeper schism. The Enlightenment's relentless pursuit of anatomical knowledge running headlong into the visceral poverty of the underclass. The air in the old town, particularly around the squalid district of the Westport, was perpetually heavy and foul. It carried the stench of open sewers, uncollected refuse, known locally as midden, and the pervasive, smoky dampness from countless coal fires. On a typical autumn night in 1828, the sounds were those of constrained misery, the distant, muffled clanging of church bells, the occasional drunken brawl echoing up a narrow wind, and the high-pitched, thin shriek of the wind whistling down from Arthur's Seat and funneling through the tight canyons of the closes. The light was almost non-existent. The only street illumination came from the faint, sputtering flicker of oil lamps, which merely intensified the surrounding darkness, creating deep pools of shadow that swallowed movement and shielded illicit activity. It was in this low-lit, desperate landscape that William Burke and William Hare operated. They were two Irish immigrants who had settled in the cheapest boarding houses of the Westport. Specifically, Hare's lodging house run by his common-law wife, Margaret Laird, and her associate, Helen McDougall, Burke's partner. Their original trade was technically that of resurrection men, or body snatchers, exhuming the recently interred for the thriving, high-demand anatomy schools of the city. The true genesis of their trade was an accident of commerce. In late 1827, an elderly lodger in Hare's house died of natural causes, still owing rent. Rather than allow the body to be buried and lost, Hare and Burke, motivated by the pure economics of the situation, decided to sell the corpse. They delivered the body to Dr. Robert Knox, the preeminent anatomist in Edinburgh and a man whose ambition for specimens far outstripped the legal supply. Knox paid them handsomely. The realization was immediate. Why expend the tremendous, risky effort of digging up heavy coffins in cold, guarded cemeteries when they could produce fresh bodies with minimal effort, zero grave dirt, and a much higher profit? The practice began with subtle predation, targeting the vulnerable and the anonymous. The physical location of their crimes became almost exclusively Hare's dilapidated tenement lodging house. The walls were thin, the privacy minimal, but in a district accustomed to violent, sudden death and extreme social detachment, the brief, muffled struggle of a single, isolated person went largely unremarked. Their method was efficient and silent. What would later be termed Burking. They would ply their victim with cheap whiskey until stupefied. Then Burke would hold the victim down while Hare covered the mouth and nose. Not choking, but smothering, applying pressure to the chest to silence and suffocate simultaneously. The technique left no external marks of struggle, no cuts or bruises that would alert the anatomist to foul play. Between late 1827 and October 1828, the two men murdered at least 16 people. The victims were a catalog of the East End's forgotten. Indigents, local prostitutes, elderly female lodgers, the occasional beggar, and most infamously, an intellectually disabled young man known as Daft Jamie, and a poor young woman named Mary Patterson. Each body, usually fresh and still warm, was then swiftly stripped, placed in a tea chest or a herring barrel, and carried under the cover of the old town's oppressive darkness, often through the very heart of the city, to the back door of Dr. Knox's Anatomy Theater at Surgeon Square. The transactions were conducted with chilling professionalism. Knox, driven by the scientific imperative to dissect and teach, asked few questions. He paid in cash and insisted the bodies be fresh. The economic reality of the medical revolution had created a perfect vacuum for the crimes. The city's darkness and the prevailing anonymity of the poor provided the geographical and social insulation the killers needed. The slow, methodical accumulation of bodies was finally broken by an act of careless confidence. In late October 1828, Burke and Hare murdered a female lodger named Margaret Doherty. They hid the body under a bed, planning the delivery for the following day. That night, two other lodgers, James and Gray, came to stay, and, suspicious of the men's evasive behavior and Burke's possessive guarding of the bed, looked under the mattress when they were briefly absent. She saw the body of Doherty, recognized her, and immediately fled to alert the police. The police response was immediate. They arrived at the Westport lodging house to find the remnants of the scene, the body, and the two couples attempting to flee or deny all knowledge. Burke, Hare, and their partners were all arrested and questioned. The evidence against them was almost entirely circumstantial, lacking the bodies of the previous victims. The ensuing legal process was hampered by the impossibility of getting convictions for all four and the difficulty of proving murder without finding the victims' remains. The Lord Advocate, a senior legal official, offered the most morally questionable deal. Hare, the more sociopathic and less remorseful of the two, was granted full immunity in exchange for his testimony against Burke. Hare's testimony was the key that unlocked the full horror of the operation. He detailed the sequence of events, the methods of Burking, and the identities of several victims. Based on this testimony, Burke was brought to trial in a courtroom filled with the most prominent citizens of Edinburgh. The trial was brief, ending in Burke's conviction. The sentence was hanging, followed by public dissection. The atmosphere of Edinburgh at the time of the execution, January 28, 1829, was one of collective, cathartic rage. A crowd estimated at 25,000 to 40,000 people converged on the Lawn Market, enduring the cold air and the brutal sunlight to witness the hanging. After his death, Burke's body was taken to the Anatomy Theater of Professor Alexander Monro. The dissection became a public spectacle, the ultimate, ironic twist of fate. A huge crowd filed past the body, shouting and cheering. The legacy of the Resurrection Men became instantly and irrevocably tied to the geography of Edinburgh. Burke's skeletal remains are still housed in the Anatomy Museum of the University of Edinburgh. Hare was released due to his immunity deal and vanished, disappearing back into the anonymous, shifting population of the working poor from which he came. Dr. Knox, though never charged, was ruined by his association with the killers and the public outrage over his ethical indifference. The murders forced an immediate legislative change. The Anatomy Act of 1832 was passed, fundamentally altering the legal supply of cadavers, effectively ending the necessity of grave robbing and, consequently, the trade that Burke and Hare had subverted. The Westport remains a place of narrow streets in the Old Town. Today, it is part of a busy tourist district, but if one stands where the lodging house once stood, the geographical atmosphere is still one of vertical compression and shadow. The sounds of modern city life cannot entirely erase the feeling of the 1820s, a place where the density of the buildings and the depth of the darkness created a perfect stage for a small, methodical enterprise built on the silent termination of the anonymous, fueled by the relentless demands of scientific progress. The cold, dark stone of the Old Town is the enduring memorial to the ultimate horror of the Enlightenment. The body as an economic commodity, taken in silence and delivered in darkness. Next story, the Stanley Park Babes in the Woods, Vancouver, British Columbia, 1947. Stanley Park in Vancouver, British Columbia, is a geography of profound, ancient forest thrust directly into a modern urban setting. It is a vast 1,000-acre peninsula defined by towering cedars and hemlocks, many centuries old, whose immense canopy creates a permanent, shadowed twilight on the forest floor, even in the brightest summer sun. The air in the park is intensely humid, carrying the deep, vegetative scent of decaying needles, wet moss, and the pervasive, cold aroma of the nearby Pacific Ocean. In the mid-20th century, parts of the park remained wild, dark, and infrequently accessed, creating small, isolated geographical pockets of pure wilderness within sight of the bustling city. The atmosphere was one of quiet, sometimes oppressive, solitude. On the morning of January 14, 1947, a park board employee working near Beaver Lake, a small, dark, and marshy body of water at the park center, was clearing brush. This mundane act of maintenance led to an abrupt, chilling discovery that shattered the park's tranquil illusion. Hidden in a dense thicket of ferns and shrubs, partially obscured by the thick root system of a massive tree, were the skeletal remains of two children. The two bodies, later identified only as babes in the woods, lay close together. The smaller child, believed to be a girl between 6 and 10 years old, was covered by a heavy, gray woolen coat. The second child, likely a boy between 8 and 10, was similarly concealed. The state of the remains, advanced decomposition, with only bone and some desiccated tissue remaining, indicated they had been in the secluded location for a long, cold period, likely months, if not longer. The initial scene was a study in grim concealment. The geography of the spot was key, a depression beneath a dense root cluster, providing a natural, secure hiding place. The perpetual cold and damp of the forest floor, coupled with the heavy canopy overhead, had slowed decomposition and preserved the site. The forensic examination of the remains introduced immediate, peculiar details. Lying next to the bodies were several key artifacts: a leather flight helmet, the type used by aviators, and a woman's size 9 rubber heel from shoe. Most unusual was the small, rusted axe, a hatchet, found near the children, wrapped in a blanket. The hatchet, though identified as the likely murder weapon due to visible trauma to the skull of the smaller child, yielded no useful fingerprints. The dense, wet earth around the burial spot, rich with moss and undergrowth, provided no clear footprints or signs of a prolonged struggle. The investigation, led by the Vancouver Police Department, was hampered by the complete anonymity of the victims. No missing persons report in the entire province matched the children's descriptions. The case immediately became one of identification. Its entire geography focused on tracing the two small, unidentified individuals. Investigators constructed a detailed profile of the children. They were well-nourished, suggesting a life not of extreme poverty, but perhaps of neglect or transient living. The clothing fragments, including a distinctive, homemade vest worn by the smaller child, fashioned from a heavy wool coat, became crucial geographical markers, suggesting a connection to an unknown home or tailor. The small, peculiar artifacts, The aviator's helmet and the shoe heel were treated as potential totems of the killer, items deliberately left behind or accidentally dropped in the chaos of disposal. The central narrative of the murder quickly revolved around a theory of domestic violence and subsequent disposal. The fact that two children, clearly related, were killed and hidden together suggested an intimate knowledge of the victims and a profound desire for their complete, permanent removal from society. The killer had chosen the park for its specific geographical benefit, its closeness to the city providing convenience, and its deep, dark center offering reliable concealment. Over the decades, the case settled into a deep, painful cold status. The initial leads, tracing the specific wool of the coat, the brand of the shoe heel, went nowhere. The lack of identification meant there was no social geography to map, no relationships to explore, and no motive to anchor the crime. The anonymity of the children provided the killer with the ultimate shield. In the early 2000s, the investigation was revitalized with forensic science. The bones were exhumed, and DNA testing confirmed the two victims were, in fact, siblings, a brother and sister. This confirmed the domestic nature of the crime. Further genetic analysis and isotopic testing of the remains revealed that the children had not lived their lives in Vancouver, but were likely from a distant geographical location, possibly Eastern or Central Europe, before being brought to the city shortly before their deaths. This finding introduced a massive, new geographical variable. The killer was not just a local resident, but a person with transnational mobility. Despite these advancements, the case remains officially unsolved. The genetic profile of the children is known, but the identity of the person who brought them to Canada and left them beneath the giant cedar roots is not. Today, Stanley Park remains a place of immense, quiet beauty. The spot where the bodies were discovered, near Beaver Lake, has been cleared and is now just a nondescript patch of moss and cedar roots. Yet, the atmosphere of the park, particularly deep within its core, carries the permanent weight of the hidden tragedy. The ancient, silent trees and the damp, black soil hold the only remaining secrets. The murder of the babes in the woods stands as a chilling testament to the power of a natural geography of the North Pacific coast to absorb and permanently conceal human violence, leaving a profound, enduring emptiness beneath the towering canopy of the Vancouver woods. Next story, the murder of Laci Peterson, Modesto, California, 2002. The atmosphere of the San Joaquin Valley in late December is defined by the two-leaf fog, a thick, opaque ground mist that rises from the damp soil of the almond orchards, turning the landscape of Modesto into a series of blurred, ghostly silhouettes. The air is cold and heavy with humidity, carrying the faint, earthy scent of river silt and the quiet, industrial breath of a valley that feeds the world. On Covina Avenue, a neighborhood of well-kept suburban homes and wide, tree-lined streets, the morning of Christmas Eve was supposed to be the vibrant start of a holiday routine. Laci Peterson, an energetic 27-year-old who was 8 months pregnant, moved through her home with the excitement of a woman on the cusp of motherhood, preparing for a dinner party and a quiet afternoon walk in the local park with her golden retriever. The mystery did not begin with a disturbance, but with a silent, domestic, empty space. When Laci's husband, Scott, returned from a solitary fishing trip to the Berkeley Marina around 5 p.m., he reported finding the house suspended in a quiet that felt foreign to their festive routine. The air in the driveway was sharp and damp as the fog began to reclaim the streets. The golden retriever was found wandering the neighborhood with its leash still attached, yet Laci was gone. When the sun set over the San Francisco Bay, the domestic sanctuary of Covina Avenue was revealed to have a void that the massive, communal search efforts would struggle to fill for months. The investigation was launched into a city that moved with the speed of a national media storm, sifting through the layers of a life that appeared to be a portrait of American bliss. Detectives focused on the timeline of the fishing trip, looking for a track in the water or a trace of movement that matched the rhythm of a man who had left his pregnant wife on a holiday. The search fanned out across the vast, dark expanse of the San Francisco Bay, where divers and sonar teams worked under the gray, heavy skies of the California winter. The air at the marina was thick with the scent of diesel and sea salt, a cold and indifferent contrast to the suburban warmth of Modesto. The investigative weight shifted fundamentally when the narrative of the husband was breached by a secret that lived in a different city. A woman from Fresno, Amber Fry, came forward to reveal a hidden relationship, acting as a key that unlocked a different story entirely. The files of the case were transformed from a localized missing persons search to a clinical, large-scale autopsy of a deception. Detectives utilized hundreds of recorded phone calls to map the psychology of a man who moved through a community's grief with a calculated, professional exterior. This digital and forensic bridge transformed the mystery from a theoretical suspicion to a cold, scientific reality, as the silence of the Bay began to give up the secrets it had held since December. The breakthrough arrived in April 2003, not through a confession, but through the patient, rhythmic movement of the tides. When the remains were discovered on the shoreline of Point Isabel, the forensic restoration of the timeline was complete. The biology of the sea acted as a silent witness, linking the recovery site to the very waters where the fishing trip had occurred months prior. The legal proceedings that followed in 2004 were a seismic cultural event, as the sanctuary of the suburban home was dissected in the glare of the courtroom. The jury was presented with a story of cold, calculated ambition, a man who had utilized the quiet anonymity of the Bay to curate a world where his domestic life was erased. Today, the house on Covina Avenue remains a quiet fixture of the neighborhood, and the almond orchards still bloom every spring in the valley. The Thule fog still rolls in on December mornings, turning the streets into a blurred, quiet sanctuary. But for those who know the history, the air near the park carries a weight of somber reflection, a reminder that justice is patient and that the truth can survive the deepest waters. Lacey is remembered not as a statistic, but as the vibrant woman whose walk home remains an unfinished narrative. The mystery has found its final legal resolution, yet the atmosphere of that December day lingers in the mist that defines the valley winter. The neighborhood is calm. The city moves with a collective memory that refuses to let the truth remain hidden, and the name Lacey Peterson stays bright in the collective memory, as constant as the stars over the San Joaquin. Next story, the Watts family murders. Frederick, Colorado, 2018. The landscape of the Colorado Front Range in mid-August is defined by an immense, parched heat and the sharp, jagged silhouette of the Rocky Mountains rising against a vibrant blue horizon. In the town of Frederick, a community built on the rhythmic expansion of suburban promise, the air is thin and carries the faint, dusty scent of high plains sage and the arid breath of the distant canyons. On Saratoga Trail, the homes are modern and uniform, projecting an atmosphere of tidy, aspirational domesticity where the sound of automated lawn sprinklers and the distant hum of oil rigs provide a steady, industrial soundtrack. On the morning of August 13th, the dawn broke over a house that appeared, to any passing observer, to be a sanctuary of young, thriving family life, a place of brightly colored toys on the porch and the orderly routine of a Monday morning. A close friend, concerned by a lack of response to text messages and a missed medical appointment, arrived at the house to find a stillness that felt suspended in time. The air in the driveway was hot and dry, and while the house was locked and the family cars were present, the vibrant energy of the domestic space had vanished. When the police conducted a welfare check later that afternoon, they found an interior that was impeccably maintained, yet hollow. The personal belongings of Shannon Watts, her phone, her purse, her medication, were left in the kitchen as if she had stepped out for only a moment. It was a domestic puzzle that stood in stark contrast to the vast, open space of the Weld County landscape outside. The investigation was launched into a community that moved with the speed of social media, sifting through the layers of a digital life that had been meticulously documented. Detectives focused on the husband, Chris Watts, whose calm, almost static demeanor during his televised pleas for his family's return unnerved the regional audience. The investigation moved away from the suburban grid to the rugged, industrial reality of the surrounding oil fields. In the quiet, dusty reaches of the Service 319 site, forensic teams worked under the scorching glare of the sun, looking for a track in the red soil that matched the movement of an industrial truck. The air at the site was thick with the scent of crude oil and the heavy, metallic heat of the machinery, a landscape that felt indifferent to the domestic sanctuary it bordered. The investigative weight shifted fundamentally when the physical truth was recovered from the very ground that supported the town's economy. The breakthrough came through a clinical reconstruction of GPS data and work logs, linking the movement of the family vehicle to the oil site in the pre-dawn hours of that Monday. The narrative moved from a localized missing persons search to a grim, large-scale forensic recovery. The atmosphere of the case changed from a theoretical suspicion to a cold, scientific certainty, as the silence of the oil fields gave up the secrets that had been hidden beneath the hatches and the soil. The files of the case became a record of a domestic collapse that was cured behind the mask of suburban normalcy, a story that highlighted the vulnerability of a life built on a digital facade. As the legal proceedings unfolded in a climate of total national shock, the focus shifted to the chilling psychology of the perpetrator. The trial revealed a story of a man who moved through his morning with a deceptive mask of unremarkable routine, finishing a workday while his family remained missing. The human element was a jarring study in the disconnect between actions and identity, a story of a generation that struggled to see the boundary between the curated image and the human reality of the people they were living with. The names of Sean-Ann, Bella, Celeste, and the unborn Nico were etched into the soul of Frederick, a landmark of a search that refused to be silenced by the anonymity of the plains. Today, the house on Saratoga Trail remains a silent fixture of the neighborhood, though for those who know the history, the air carries a weight of somber reflection. The mountains still stand against the sky, and the oil rigs continue to thud in the distance, ancient and rhythmic. The memory of the family is kept by those who remain, a silent vigil for the light to finally reach the end of the suburban road. The town continues to grow, but the story of 2018 lingers as a quiet, atmospheric reminder of the importance of the truth beneath the surface of the everyday. The mystery has found its final legal resolution, yet the atmosphere of the case remains in the quiet, reflective moments of those who understand the fragility of safety. As the evening settles over the Front Range, the town sleeps with the knowledge that some secrets are kept by the earth, while the names of those we lose stay bright in the collective memory. The wind sighs through the sagebrush, the stars come out over the peaks, and the memory of that August morning remains a quiet, guiding light in the ongoing search for an answer that time can never hide. Next story, the Soham Murders. UK, 2002. Imagine the fenlands of East Anglia in the peak of a humid, restless August. The air in the small village of Soham is thick with the scent of harvest dust, ripening sugar beet, and the damp, stagnant water of the drainage dikes that line the flat, low-lying horizon. It is a landscape defined by its immense sky and a stillness that seems to amplify the smallest sound. In early August 2002, the atmosphere was one of typical summer relaxation, where the village was a quiet haven of red brick houses and community schools. Holly Wells and Jessica Chapman, both 10 years old and inseparable best friends, moved through this world with the carefree energy of Sunday evening. They were wearing identical Manchester United shirts, a bright splash of red against the muted greens and grays of the village lanes, looking for a moment of independence on a day that felt as safe as any other in the heart of England. The mystery did not begin with a disturbance, but with a silent, growing awareness that the rhythm of the evening had been breached. The girls were last captured on a grainy security camera walking past the local sports center at 6:15 p.m., moving with the purposeful, rhythmic gait of two friends on a short stroll to buy sweets. The air was warm, and the village was moving toward the quiet of the night. Yet when the sun set behind the fens, the girls had not returned. As the hours passed, the sanctuary of the suburban streets became a stage for a collective mobilization that the village had never known. The initial search was conducted by hundreds of volunteers, their flashlights cutting through the dark orchards and the reed-filled dikes, calling two names that would soon be etched into the national consciousness. The investigation was launched into a community that was suddenly aware of the shadows in its own familiar grid. For 2 weeks, the files of the Cambridgeshire Constabulary grew, with reports of suspicious vehicles seen in the narrow fen roads and strangers lurking near the sports center. The air in Soham was heavy with the scent of cut grass and the sound of helicopters mapping the vast, flat landscape. Detectives turned their focus to the local secondary school, a modern complex where a newly arrived caretaker had been one of the last people to speak to the girls. The narrative moved between the hope of a discovery in the fields and the forensic scrutiny of the domestic spaces nearby, a record of a search that was being conducted under the immense, unwavering gaze of the international media. The investigative weight shifted fundamentally when the physical evidence was recovered not in the village, but in the remote, wooded reaches of Lakenheath, nearly 20 miles away. The atmosphere of the case changed from a localized missing persons search to a clinical, large-scale forensic vigil. Forensic teams in white suits worked under the baking heat of the East Anglian sun, sifting through the forest floor for a trace of a struggle or a discarded item. The breakthrough came not from the soil, but from a singular, discarded clue found in a bin at the Soham school: the remnants of the red Manchester United shirts. This discovery acted as a forensic bridge back to the caretaker's residence, identifying the domestic sanctuary of the school as the site where the village's peace had been broken. As the legal proceedings unfolded in 2003, the focus shifted to the psychology of the perpetrator and the institutional failures that allowed him to work within the school system. The trial revealed a story of a man who moved through the village with a deceptive mask of normalcy, curate a secret history of predation that the manual vetting systems of the era had failed to link. The Soham Murders files were transformed into a constitutional landmark, leading to a fundamental overhaul of how individuals are vetted and how public safety is measured against the right to privacy. The human element remained centered on the Wells and Chapman families, who maintained a dignified, heartbreaking presence throughout the search, embodiments of a community that had been permanently altered. Today, the village of Soham has reclaimed its quiet routine, though for those who walk the lanes past the sports center, the air carries a weight of somber reflection. The red brick houses still stand, and the immense fen sky remains as beautiful and indifferent as it was in 2002. The memorial garden at the school is a place of reflective beauty, where the trees rustle softly in the wind, and the names of the two girls are kept bright by a community that refused to let the darkness define them. The fens remain a landscape of ancient silence, a reminder that while the truth can be hidden in the vastness of the fields, it eventually finds its way into the light. The names Holly Wells and Jessica Chapman stay bright in the collective memory, as constant as the evening stars over the lowlands. As the shadows lengthen over Soham, the village sleeps with the knowledge that the truth was found in the persistence of the search and the moral courage of those who demanded change. The dikes still flow steadily toward the sea. The fields turn to gold every August, and the memory of that Sunday evening lingers as a quiet, atmospheric reminder of the fragility of safety and the endurance of love. Next story: the disappearance of Susie Lampla. Fulham, UK, 1986. The upscale neighborhood of Fulham on a Monday afternoon in late July was a landscape of polished brass door knockers, sun-drenched terraced houses, and the quiet, rhythmic hum of a prestigious district in its summer prime. In 1986, the air was warm, smelling of drying pavement and the manicure gardens behind the white stucco walls. Susie Lampla was a 25-year-old estate agent, a woman characterized by her vibrancy, her professional ambition, and a poised confidence that defined the era's aspirational culture. On the morning of July 28th, she arrived at her office on the New Kings Road, preparing for a routine day of property viewings. The atmosphere was one of typical business efficiency, yet tucked in her diary was a singular, mundane entry for 12:45 p.m., a meeting with a Mr. Kipper at a property on Shorolds Road. The departure from the office was recorded as a routine event in the agency's log. noting that Susie left on foot, carrying only her car keys and a small amount of pocket money. She was seen by neighbors arriving at the property, parking her white Ford Fiesta with the same easy efficiency she brought to every viewing. The afternoon light in Fulham was bright, casting long, sharp shadows across the quiet residential street. But as the clock moved toward the evening and the office prepared to close, the realization settled in that Susie had not returned. When her car was discovered later that night, abandoned just a few hundred yards away with the ignition keys missing but her handbrake off, the domestic safety of the neighborhood was revealed to have been a stage for an absolute chilling absence. The investigation began not with a flurry of sirens, but with a silent, growing dread among her colleagues and family. The Metropolitan Police launched one of the most exhaustive missing persons searches in the history of London, combing the basements and gardens of every property in the surrounding streets. They looked into the quiet, gated parks and the dark edges of the nearby cemetery, but the urban grid offered no traces of a struggle. The air in Fulham was thick with the scent of a mystery that lived in a diary entry. Who was Mr. Kipper, and did he ever truly exist? Detectives scrutinized the phone records and the professional history of the agency, yet the man from the appointment remained a ghost, hidden by the anonymity of a landline call and a generic name. The narrative of the city shifted toward the transit hubs and the potential for a journey that extended far beyond West London. Leads took investigators into the heart of the British prison system and into the shadowy social circles of high-risk individuals, following tips that promised a resolution only for the silence to return as firmly as the evening fog. They looked for a specific individual seen driving a black vehicle near the scene, but the 1980s lacked the digital vigil of modern CCTV, leaving the police to rely on the shifting memories of passersby. The geography of the case eventually focused on the sprawling, rural reaches of the Norton Barracks in Worcestershire, where massive excavations were conducted under the gray, brooding skies of the Midlands. The air there was cold and damp, a stark contrast to the summer light of Fulham. Yet the soil kept its counsel. The human element of the case remained centered on the Lamplugh family, who transformed their private grief into a national pillar of safety advocacy. They maintained a relentless pursuit of the truth, their presence a constant reminder of the unanswered questions that defined the decade. The case moved through many legal and investigative cycles, including the identification of a prime suspect who was already serving a life sentence for other crimes. This individual remained the focus of professional forensic scrutiny for years, yet the evidence was a collection of coincidences, a lack of a solid alibi, and a history of similar behaviors that didn't quite lock into a formal conviction. The truth remained suspended in a state of almost held back by the passage of time and the lack of physical restoration. As the 1990s gave way to a new millennium, the file on Susie Lamplugh remained a living document in the cold case archives of New Scotland Yard. The investigation was revisited with every major breakthrough in forensic science, utilizing advancements in soil analysis and genetic tracking that didn't exist when Susie walked down Shorolds Road. Every few years, a fresh search was launched in the quiet woodlands or the redundant military sites of the interior, sparked by a new tip or a technological refinement. These moments were characterized by a somber, clinical focus, a collective effort to bridge the 30-year gap between a summer afternoon and a definitive answer. Yet, each search ended in a return to the mystery, a testament to the scale of the silence created that day. Today, the New King's Road remains a bustling artery of London life, and the property on Shorolds Road is once again a private residence, tucked into the quiet rhythm of the neighborhood. The white stucco walls still glow in the July sun, and the sound of children playing in the parks nearby remains a constant. For those who walk these streets with a knowledge of history, the air carries a weight of reflective awareness, a reminder of the fragility of a routine. The world has changed. The estate agencies are now digital, and the streets are watched over by cameras that never blink. But the name Susie Lamplugh is etched into the stone and the soil of Fulham, a landmark of a search that refused to be silenced. The mystery remains open. focusing on the ongoing search for justice and the dignity of the woman whose vibrancy defined a generation of Londoners. The investigation remains a testament to the persistent work of those who refuse to let a life be lost to time. As the evening settles over West London, the neighborhood sleeps with the knowledge that the truth is patient, waiting beneath the layers of history and the shifting pavement of the city. The streets are calm, the Thames flows steadily nearby, and the story of 1986 lingers as a quiet, atmospheric vigil for the light to finally reach the end of the road. Next story, the murders of the Bloody Benders. Kansas, 1870 to 1873. Labette County, situated on the main southern trail used by settlers moving toward the vast, undeveloped lands of the West, was an endless, rolling vista of sun-scorched grass and deep, unbreaking silence. The air was dry and hot in the summer, carrying the sharp, dusty scent of prairie scrub and the metallic, high tang of distant thunder. In the colder months, the wind swept across the open land with an unnerving, ceaseless moan. This geographical desolation was the primary characteristic of the area. Travelers moved slowly, often alone, separated by miles of wilderness from any form of settlement or law enforcement. The soundscape was dominated by the raw elements. The persistent whir of insects in the tall grass, the creak of wagon wheels, and the terrifying absence of human sound. At night, the darkness was absolute, relieved only by the huge, indifferent sprawl of the stars, a perfect canvas for anonymity. It was precisely this profound isolation that allowed the Bender family to establish their infamous enterprise. They settled in 1870 on a small, 160-acre claim near the Osage Mission Trail, erecting a single-room log cabin that served as both their dwelling and a general store and inn. The family consisted of John Bender Sr., a gruff, heavily accented man, his wife, Kate, who was known for her stern demeanor and purported spiritualist powers, and their adult children, John Jr. and Kate Jr., the two younger members, John Jr., who was prone to fits of wild laughter, and Kate Jr., who was strikingly attractive and marketed herself as a spiritual healer, were the faces of the operation, drawing in the exhausted, lonely travelers. The cabin itself was a geographical anomaly, a single, thin structure set against an overwhelming landscape, designed to offer a brief, desperate refuge. The interior was divided by a heavy, canvas curtain hung across the middle of the room. The Benders lived on one side. The other side contained a simple table for meals and two crude bunks for travelers. The trap. The modus operandi was simple, brutal, and utterly dependent on the remoteness of the location. A traveler, often carrying cash and supplies, would be welcomed, fed, and invited to take a seat at the main table. The Benders would ensure the victim's back was placed toward the heavy canvas curtain. As the unsuspecting guest ate, John Sr. or John Jr. would emerge silently from behind the curtain, lifting a sledgehammer with practiced ease. The victim would be struck from behind, collapsing instantly. Kate Sr. or Kate Jr. would then typically ensure death with a knife to the throat. The crime scene was instantly ready for cleanup. Beneath the trapdoor concealed beneath the victim's chair was a shallow pit, where the bodies were dropped before the inevitable, swift burial. The sounds of the struggle, if any, were muffled by the dry, packed earth floor, the thick log walls, and the vast, absorbing silence of the prairie outside. Within hours, the body would be transported by wagon, usually under the cover of the absolute night, and interred in the small, recently plowed orchard behind the cabin. The prairie's capacity to swallow evidence was limitless. The string of disappearances began almost immediately. Settlers, farmers, and wealthy travelers moving through Labette County simply vanished without a trace. Their money, horses, and wagons were gone. Because the victims were transients, there was no initial centralization of concern. They were simply recorded as lost to the vastness of the frontier. The Benders' only contribution to the investigation was to claim that the victims had moved on, likely killed by Native Americans or other bandits further down the trail. A pivotal moment occurred in the spring of 1873. A prominent physician, Dr. William York, passed through the area in search of a friend who had disappeared months earlier. Dr. York stopped at the Bender cabin, spoke briefly with Kate Jr., and then, too, vanished. Dr. York had powerful, influential brothers, including Colonel Ed York, a state senator. The disappearance of a man of this status galvanized the local community and state authorities. A formal search was organized, moving systematically through the sparsely populated county. Colonel York led a search party to the Bender cabin. They found a family present, apparently calm. Though questioned, the Benders remained composed, but their strange behavior, particularly John Jr.'s nervous, wild laughter, left a lasting impression of profound unease. The search party left, deciding to return the following day. However, when the party returned, they found the cabin entirely deserted. The Benders had vanished as completely as their victims. Their livestock was abandoned, their meager possessions left behind. The door was padlocked. It was the local curiosity of a few neighbors, aided by a sense of foreboding, that finally initiated the gruesome discovery. They broke into the silent, abandoned cabin. The atmosphere within was instantly recognizable. Not the smell of decomposition, but the metallic, coppery scent of old, packed blood. They found the dried bloodstains, not just on the canvas curtain, but heavily ingrained in the dirt floor beneath the canvas partition and near the main table. When the searchers struck the floor with a hammer, they located the hollow sound of the shallow pit beneath where the travelers had been forced to sit. The hole was empty, but the evidence of what had transpired was indisputable. The discovery then moved to the Bender small orchard. Using a probe, the searchers located the disturbed soil. The ensuing excavation revealed a mass grave containing the remains of over a dozen people, including Dr. York, often with signs of blunt force trauma to the head and knife wounds to the throat. The number of victims was never definitively established, but the estimated count was between 12 and 20. The geography had held the secret. The victims had been buried just deep enough to escape the probes of animals, but close enough to the surface for an experienced eye to recognize the disturbance. The Benders became the subject of one of the largest manhunts in American history. Colonel York led the relentless pursuit, mobilizing every law enforcement asset available. The hunt stretched across the continent, fueled by sensationalized reports and large rewards. Despite the intensity of the search, the Benders were never seen again. They simply dissolved back into the transient population that had given them cover. The prevailing theory is that they used their stolen wealth to quickly board a train, shedding their identities somewhere in the vast, still untamed territory of the West or Southwest. The possibility remains that they were caught and lynched by vigilantes who failed to notify authorities, or that they adopted new names and integrated into a new, distant settlement. The cabin was dismantled by souvenir hunters, leaving nothing but the empty foundation and the silent orchard, the final resting place of their victims. The mystery of their escape remains sealed by the sheer geographical size and under-policing of the American frontier at the time. Today, the site of the Bender homestead in Labette County is marked by a simple historical plaque, a physical point in an otherwise undifferentiated expanse of land. The silence there is still immense, broken only by the wind and the distant passage of modern vehicles. Next story, the Greenbrier Ghost Case. West Virginia, 1897. The atmosphere of Greenbrier County, West Virginia, in the late 19th century was defined by its deep, rugged geography. This was a place of Appalachian isolation, characterized by towering, mist-shrouded peaks, narrow, winding valleys, and dense, dark forests that seemed to swallow the light. The air was perpetually cool, smelling of damp earth, pine needles, and the faint, coppery scent of the creek water running over limestone. The small, close-knit farming community of Richlands, nestled in one of these remote valleys, operated under a sense of quiet permanence, its rhythm dictated by the seasons and the hard work of agriculture. The soundscape was primarily natural, the rustle of wind through the heavy canopy, the distant clip-clop of a horse, the lowing of cattle, and the absolute silence that fell after sundown, a silence so profound it seemed to amplify the smallest domestic sound. the crackle of a wood stove, the creak of floorboards. The light was clean, rural, and unforgiving, either brilliant and sharp or completely extinguished by the heavy mountain night. It was into this outwardly placid, deeply rooted environment that the tragedy of Zona Hester Shue unfolded. Zona was a young woman, described as having a pleasant, gentle nature. In October 1896, she married Erasmus Stribling Trout Shue, known locally as Edward. Shue was a blacksmith, a man of some height and outward charm, but a newcomer to the county with a mysterious, unsettling past. The couple lived in a simple, rented cabin in the valley. On January 23, 1897, Edward Shue dispatched a young neighbor boy, Andy Jones, to the house on an errand. The boy found Zona's body at the foot of the stairs, lying in an unnatural position. The geography of the small cabin, its confinement and domesticity, was the first constraint of the crime scene. Edward Shue arrived shortly after the discovery. His behavior at the scene was immediate and possessive. Before the county doctor, George Knapp, could arrive and perform a proper examination, Shue had already moved his wife's body to the upstairs bedroom and, with a strange, nervous diligence, dressed her in a high-necked gown with a heavily starched collar. He then placed a large silk scarf or veil over her face. When Dr. Knapp finally arrived at the small cabin after a difficult ride, he found Shue guarding the body, weeping dramatically. The doctor attempted an examination, but was repeatedly obstructed by Edward, who clutched his wife's head and neck, preventing Knapp from thoroughly examining the area around her throat, weeping that the sight caused Zona discomfort. Given the remoteness of the location and the lack of visible injury, a testament to Shue's careful concealment, Knapp, a busy practitioner, relied on Edward's tearful explanation. Zona had suffered an everlasting faint or complications from an earlier illness. The official cause of death was recorded as everlasting faint. Zona Shue was quickly buried in a simple service, and the community, sympathetic to the bereaved husband, assumed the matter was closed. The rugged geography of the county seemed to promise that the secret would be buried with her. The official narrative was accepted by all but one person, Zona's mother, Mary Jane Hester. Mrs. Hester was an elderly woman steeped in the spiritual and cultural traditions of the Appalachian region. She harbored a profound, visceral distrust of her son-in-law. For weeks following the burial, Mary Jane maintained that her daughter's spirit was restless and unable to find peace. Then, for weeks after Zona's death, Mary Jane claimed to have received a series of visits from her daughter's specter, the Greenbrier ghost. According to Mary Jane, the ghostly visitations occurred over 4 successive nights, in the intimate, quiet space of her own bedroom. The spirit, Mary Jane claimed, described her murder in chilling detail. The ghost informed her mother that Edward Shue was a cruel man, and that he had murdered her in a fit of rage after she refused to cook meat for him. The spirit revealed the precise mechanism of death. Edward had violently snapped her neck at the first and second cervical vertebrae. To prove the truth of her claim, the ghost, in Mary Jane's telling, turned her head completely around, showing the mechanism of the break. Mary Jane Hester was not merely grieving. She was convinced. She immediately took her story to the local prosecutor, Colonel John Alfred Preston. In the remote, pragmatic setting of Greenbrier County, a murder investigation prompted by a supernatural claim should have been dismissed instantly. Yet, Preston was a methodical, civic-minded man. He knew of the community's disquiet regarding Edward Shue's behavior and Dr. Knapp's rushed examination. More critically, he was aware of the dark rumors about Edward Shue's past, which included a previous marriage that had ended in a hasty, unexplained death. The geographical isolation of the area provided a perfect shield for Shue's pattern of behavior. Preston ordered the exhumation of Zona Shue's body. The legal order was served on Edward Shue, whose composure instantly shattered. He flew into a hysterical rage, loudly protesting the exhumation in the town square. His frantic opposition only served to solidify the community's suspicions. On February 22, 1897, Zona's coffin was raised from the grave in the quiet cemetery and transported to the local one-room schoolhouse for the autopsy. The local atmosphere was electric with quiet tension. Under the intense scrutiny of local officials and a crowd of silent, watchful neighbors, Dr. Knapp and two other doctors performed a detailed postmortem. The findings confirmed the ghost claims. The examination of the neck revealed that the cervical vertebrae were indeed fractured. Specifically, the first and second vertebrae were broken, and the ligaments in the neck were severed, a condition that would only be possible if the head had been violently twisted or wrenched. The high collar and thick scarf, placed so carefully by Edward Shue, had been an effective, if simple, means of concealment against a casual medical glance. Edward Shue was immediately arrested. The subsequent trial was held in the Greenbrier County Courthouse, bringing a surge of outsiders to the quiet mountain town. Prosecutor Preston, in an audacious move, introduced Mary Jane Hester's testimony, the visitation of the ghost, not as evidence of fact, but as the catalyst that led to the discovery of the physical, forensic evidence of murder. The defense lawyer spent considerable time attempting to discredit Mary Jane's testimony, only to inadvertently give the ghost's account wide public attention. The jury, composed of local men who understood the complex weave of folklore, community obligation, and forensic reality, was out for less than an hour. Edward Shue was convicted of murder and sentenced to life in prison. He died in the West Virginia Penitentiary a few years later. The legacy of the Greenbrier ghost is unique. It is the only case in American legal history where the testimony of a purported spectral entity led directly to the conviction of a murderer. While the cause of the conviction was the shattered neck vertebrae, the physical reality, the catalyst for the discovery was Mary Jane Hester's absolute, unwavering conviction based on her supernatural encounters. Today, Greenbrier County is still a place of imposing hills and quiet valleys. The cabin is gone, but the courthouse still stands. The atmosphere of the region still holds that blend of quiet community and deep, isolated mystery. The story is permanently etched into the local geography, a reminder that in places where the mountains keep their own counsel and the silence is immense, sometimes the secrets of the dead are brought to light not by witnesses in the flesh, but by a mother's conviction and the chilling narrative of an Appalachian ghost. Next story, The Torsos of the Thames. London, England, 1887 to 1889. Imagine standing on the muddy bank of the River Thames on a cold, gray afternoon in the late 1880s. The water is a churning, brackish mass, moving with the relentless pull of the tide, carrying with it the entire foul history of London. The geographical atmosphere of the Thames is one of industrial melancholy. The air is always heavy, saturated with the smell of coal smoke from 1,000 hearths, the pungent aroma of wet ropes and diesel from the tugs, and the deep, organic rot of the exposed foreshore mud at ebb tide. This is the central artery of Victorian London, a liquid landscape of commerce and secrecy, bounded by the dark brick canyons of the city and its sprawling docklands. The soundscape is a constant, low-frequency hum. The mournful, hollow blare of ships' horns in the fog, the echoing shouts of dockworkers from the Pool of London, and the heavy, sloshing sigh of the river itself, perpetually grinding the gravel and debris against the ancient stone embankments. The light, even at midday, struggles to penetrate the persistent, sooty haze that hangs over the water. It is a place of deep, atmospheric gloom, a perfect, expansive setting for things to be taken, lost, and then returned, irrevocably altered by the current. The mystery began quietly, without fanfare, in the late spring of 1887. On May 11th, a police constable patrolling the river near Rainham, far downriver in Essex, made a gruesome find: a human torso, wrapped in a coarse cloth, floating near the shoreline. It was the remains of a woman, carefully disarticulated, the head, limbs, and external organs professionally removed. The remaining structure had been expertly stripped of flesh, leaving a bony mass of torso and hips. The water had cleansed the evidence, but the manner of preparation spoke volumes of skill and calculation. This was not an isolated event. Over the next 2.5 years, more fragments emerged from the thick, opaque flow of the river. The locations of discovery were geographically disparate, stretching along the tidal portion of the Thames from Westminster and Lambeth in the heart of the city, out past the docks to Raynham and eventually the mouth of the river. The findings followed a grim, consistent pattern that suggested a single, terrifying source. June 4th, 1888, Pimlico, a left leg and foot, found near the High Society district, suggesting the killer was active in the city center, or merely using the river's extensive flow to dispose of evidence from that region. September 10th, 1888, Whitehall, a human female arm and hand, retrieved from the river adjacent to Scotland Yard itself. A gesture of chilling proximity that deeply unnerved the authorities. June 5th, 1889, Horsley Down, a partially submerged torso, discovered floating near ships. Mooring. This was confirmed to be a different woman than the previous finds, again meticulously dissected. The cases quickly became known in the press as the Thames torso murders. The method was the forensic key. The victims were all women, typically heavy-set, and had all been subjected to a highly skilled process of dismemberment. The cuts were not random or frantic. They were precise, indicating a knowledge of human anatomy, suggesting the involvement of someone with medical, veterinary, or butchery experience. The killer was clearly utilizing the massive, liquid geography of the Thames not just as a dumping ground, but as a distribution mechanism, scattering the parts to ensure identification was virtually impossible. The river, with its relentless, obliterating currents, was effectively the killer's accomplice. The police faced enormous geographical and logistical challenges. The crime spanned multiple police jurisdictions: the Metropolitan Police, the City of London Police, and the Thames River Police, all of which struggled to coordinate their efforts on the fast-moving body of water. Crucially, the absence of heads and limbs meant that the foundational requirement for an 1880s murder investigation, identification, was entirely absent. Without a name, there was no starting point, no means to determine the victim's history, associates, or last known movements. The investigation took on an unusual direction because of the geographic context. The finds were happening concurrently with the infamous Whitechapel murders of 1888. The police were under intense pressure to link the two sets of crimes, given the brutal nature of the attacks. However, forensic analysis argued against the connection. The Whitechapel victims were not dismembered beyond the mutilation of internal organs in some cases, and the crime scenes were confined to street. The Thames victims were primarily dismembered, and the only scene was the flowing river itself. The Thames torso killer was fundamentally different, focused on disposal, not public display. One piece of potential forensic evidence emerged with the torso found in Battersea in September 1888. A piece of clothing known as a chemise was wrapped around the remains. Police used this cloth to attempt to trace the murder back to the London laundry trade, but the trail went cold quickly. The most notable attempt at identification involved the remains found in 1889, which the press dubbed the Pinchin Street torso, though it was found in Horsley Down. This torso was eventually identified through a process of elimination and a rare surviving article of clothing as Elizabeth Jackson, a woman of the impoverished working class. This breakthrough, though late, allowed investigators to establish that she was last seen in the Whitechapel area, reinforcing the proximity of the killer's operations to the East End. Despite the identification of Jackson, the investigation stalled. The lack of a head or limbs meant no definitive cause of death beyond the dismemberment itself. The police were left with theories. Perhaps a medical student run amok, a sadistic butcher, or a sailor with a knowledge of anatomy who could move fluidly between the docks and the city. The Thames, being a porous barrier, gave the killer the perfect fluid escape route. The murders ceased as abruptly as they began. The last confirmed finding linked to the case occurred in 1889. The ultimate identity and motive of the Thames torso killer were never established. The cases remain cold, overshadowed by the more sensational, less geographically dispersed terror of Jack the Ripper. The river, however, retains the essential memory of the crime. Today, the tidal Thames remains a dark, powerful force, sweeping past the glass towers and steel bridges of modern London. The water is cleaner, the smell of coal is gone, but the sound of the relentless pull of the tide against the shore remains unchanged. It is a continuous, indifferent mechanism, silently reminding the city that its vastness and complexity are not just arteries of commerce, but perfect, shifting graves, capable of both revealing and eternally obscuring the secrets poured into its flow. Next story, the murder of William Goldensup. East River, New York, 1897. The East River in the winter of 1897 was less a river and more a moving, chaotic corridor of frigid brine and refuse, separating the dense, clamorous sprawl of Manhattan from the industrial docks and burgeoning neighborhoods of Brooklyn and Long Island City. The geographical atmosphere was one of profound urban anonymity. The air, particularly after a cold snap, carried the sharp, biting scent of raw salt mixed with the pervasive, sulfurous odor of the city's millions of coal stoves and factory exhausts. The soundscape of this region was dominated by the immense, non-stop machinery of New York. The ceaseless, vibrating thrum of ferryboats and tugs, the grating shriek of iron wheels on the elevated rail lines that hugged the waterfront, and the deep, echoing slosh of water against the pilings of the piers. The light was harsh and cold, reflecting off the oily surface of the water, a dim winter glare that failed to penetrate the deep shadows cast by the looming truss bridges and the vast, dark profiles of anchored ships. This was a place where things disappeared easily, shrouded by fog, swallowed by the tide, or simply lost in the overwhelming physical and social complexity of the port. The events that would rivet the city began in the first week of February 1897. The initial discovery was made on the Manhattan side of the river, near the docks of the East 11th Street ferry slip. On Tuesday, February 2nd, a police officer on patrol noticed a large, rolled-up bundle floating near the bulkhead. Upon retrieving it, the officer made a horrifying determination. The package contained the heavily mutilated, partially decomposed torso of a human male. The forensic reality was shocking. The head, limbs, and all internal organs had been meticulously removed. The remains were heavy-set, suggesting a robust frame. The discovery was not singular. Over the next 2 weeks, the East River and its tributaries became the unwilling repository for more fragments of the same body, scattered geographically across the entire metropolitan area. The tidal flow had carried the evidence far and wide, making the river the primary obstacle to the investigation. February 4th. Harlem River, a left leg and foot, were discovered miles away, near the High Bridge, floating in the dark, tributary waters of the Harlem River. February 7th. East 84th Street Pier, the second leg, similarly severed, was found near Manhattan Pier. February 15th. Brooklyn, the head, wrapped in a black cloth and showing signs of crushing blow that was likely the cause of death. Washed ashore on the Brooklyn side of the river. The sheer volume and wide geographic distribution of the remains made the case impossible to ignore. The press quickly dubbed it the Goldensup murder, after the initial identification of the victim. Through examining the fingerprints and distinctive markings on the torso, specifically a healed scar and evidence of his profession, police identified the victim as William Goldensup, a 35-year-old German-American bathhouse attendant who worked in the high-end establishment of the Murray Hill Baths. The identification of Goldensup immediately shifted the geographical focus of the investigation from the chaotic waterfront to the specific, confined space of his life, the bathhouse and his lodgings in Manhattan. Detectives quickly homed in on two primary figures in his close circle, a triangle of bitter jealousy and financial motive. The central figures were August Knack, a middle-aged, diminutive pharmacist who ran a respected apothecary in East 16th Street, and his mistress, Maria Barbella, a married, fiery Italian immigrant known for her dramatic emotional swings. Barbella had been having a tumultuous affair with Goldensup, often meeting him at Knack's apartment, a dark, third-floor residence above the pharmacy. The apartment was the contained, silent center of the crime, a domestic space violently ruptured. The motive was quickly established as jealousy and control. Knack, obsessed with Barbella and paranoid about Golden Sup, convinced Barbella that the bath attendant was planning to leave her and expose their illicit relationship. The two conspired to eliminate Golden Sup. The murder itself took place within the confines of Knack's apartment. Golden Sup was lured there on January 25th under the pretense of a late-night rendezvous with Barbella. Once inside, Knack struck Golden Sup with a sharp, heavy blow to the head, likely an axe or a large club, killing him instantly. The most horrific and telling phase of the crime followed: the meticulous dismemberment. The process, executed by Knack, revealed a cool, methodical mindset. The victim was severed into pieces, allegedly using surgical tools from the pharmacy, and then packaged for disposal. The geographical atmosphere of the East River was the killer's co-conspirator. The body parts were then loaded onto a small rowboat and scattered individually into the tidal currents, guaranteeing that the pieces would never be found together. Knack assumed the river's vastness and perpetual flow would ensure the absolute disappearance of the evidence. Knack and Barbella were quickly arrested after the discovery of the head and the establishment of Golden Sup's relationships. The subsequent trial of August Knack was a sensation, focusing on the sheer depravity of the dismemberment and the calculated use of the river to dispose of the body. Knack broke down and confessed, implicating Barbella, but taking primary responsibility for the murder and the disarticulation. Maria Barbella was also tried separately, initially convicted, but the verdict was later overturned due to legal errors, and she was eventually acquitted after a second trial. Knack, however, was convicted and executed in 1899. His confession detailed the process of dismemberment and the eerie boat ride across the frigid river, throwing the wrapped fragments one by one into the current, relying on the geographical complexity of the city's waterways to hide his deed. The Golden Sup murder became one of the most famous anatomical crimes of the Gilded Age, setting a chilling precedent for the use of the urban environment as a means of crime concealment. The East River, the central geographical feature of the disposal, became permanently linked to the crime. Today, the waterfront of the East River is lined with parks and towering modern residences. The elevated trains are gone, replaced by subterranean lines, and the industrial odor has largely dissipated. But the river itself remains a powerful, dark force. When standing on one of the Brooklyn or Manhattan bridges, looking down into the rapid flow of the water, one can still sense the vast, cold capacity of the current. It is an immense, ceaseless geographical force that, in the late 19th century, was considered the perfect accomplice, an ultimate, indifferent mechanism capable of dissolving all human trace and ensuring that the remains of a man, taken in a small, dark room, would be scattered into the cold, chaotic anonymity of the world's fastest-moving city. Next story: the disappearance of Bryce Laspiza, Castaic, California, 2013. The landscape of the Interstate 5 corridor in California is a world defined by movement and the vast, amber stretches of the Central Valley. In late August 2013, the air was shimmering with the persistent heat of a Southern California summer, a dry, oppressive warmth that lingers long after the sun dips behind the rugged silhouettes of the Sierra Pelona Mountains. Bryce Laspiza, a 19-year-old college student with a bright future and a shock of red hair, was driving south from Northern California, heading toward his family home in Laguna Niguel. It was a journey of nearly 500 miles, a routine transit through the heart of the state that typically takes the measure of a single day. But on the night of August 29th, the rhythm of that journey began to stutter and stall in the quiet, dusty turnouts of the Kern County roads. The mystery did not begin with a disappearance, but with a series of prolonged, static moments. Bryce spent nearly 20 hours sitting in his car in a small town along the route, seemingly suspended in a state of hesitation. His parents, in constant contact by phone, encouraged him to start the final leg of the drive, but Bryce seemed tethered to the spot by a quiet, internal weight that he could not articulate. Finally, in the early hours of August 30th, he resumed his drive south toward the Tejon Pass. At 2 a.m., he called his mother to say he was pulling off the road to sleep, assuring her he was safe and would see them in the morning. His car was later spotted near the Castaic Lake Recreation Area, a quiet reservoir nestled in the scrub-covered hills. Just a few hours later, at dawn, a transport driver discovered Bryce's Toyota Highlander on its side at the bottom of a steep embankment overlooking the lake. The back window had been smashed from the inside, and the vehicle was empty. But this was not a standard accident scene. The air was still, and the surrounding brush showed no sign of a body. Inside the car, Bryce's phone, wallet, and laptop were left behind, abandoned in the wreckage. There was a singular drop of blood on the headrest, but no sign of life. The silence of the lake was absolute, and Bryce Laspiza had vanished from the center of a life that appeared, on the surface, to be entirely intact. The investigation was launched into the rugged, arid terrain of the Angeles National Forest. Search and rescue teams combed the dry canyons and the edges of the lake, looking for a 19-year-old who might be disoriented or injured. They utilized divers to scour the depths of the reservoir and helicopters to scan the vast, golden hillsides. Investigators looked into Bryce's recent behavior at college, uncovering reports that he had been increasingly distracted and had given away his belongings to friends, a detail that added a somber, psychological depth to the case. It suggested a young man who was divesting himself of his life, perhaps preparing for a departure that the highway only facilitated. Over the years, the search for Bryce has occupied a unique space in the public imagination, sustained by his parents' relentless pursuit of the truth. Sightings have been reported from the streets of Portland to the coastal towns of Mexico, yet each lead has dissolved like a mirage in the heat. Private investigators scrutinized the physics of the crash, suggesting that the car had been driven off the road with a deliberate intent, rather than a loss of control. The mystery remains locked in those few hours between his last phone call and the discovery of the car, a void in the narrative that no witness or forensic clue has been able to fill. The legacy of the Laspiza case is one of persistent, echoing questions. The Castaic Lake area remains a popular spot for weekenders and hikers, yet for those who know the story, the hills carry a sense of watchful silence. It is a mystery that highlights the fragility of the transition into adulthood and the unknown internal landscapes that people carry with them while driving through the world. Bryce's family continues to maintain a digital presence, a beacon for anyone who might recognize a face that hasn't been seen in over a decade. Today, the I-5 freeway remains a constant river of headlights and taillights, moving past the turnoff for Castaic Lake without pause. The wreckage of the car has long since been cleared, and the embankment is once again covered in dry grass and sagebrush. The truth of Bryce Laspiza's ending is held somewhere in those quiet canyons, or perhaps in a city far away, kept by a young man who walked away from the wreckage of his car into the darkness of the morning. The investigation is a quiet vigil, waiting for a single piece of evidence to drift up through the dust of the California hills. Next story, the Alphabet Murders. Rochester, New York, 1971 to 1973. On the gray, overcast afternoons of the early 1970s, the industrial city of Rochester moved to the rhythmic hum of Kodak cameras and Xerox machines. The atmosphere was one of hard work and Midwestern sensibilities, where the streets were lined with modest family homes, and the air often carried the scent of autumn leaves or the metallic tang of the nearby Great Lakes. It was an era of perceived safety, where children walked to school and the grocery store without a second thought. But beginning in November 1971, a linguistic shadow began to fall over the city as a pattern emerged that felt more like a chilling literary puzzle than a series of random events. The first thread of the mystery began with 10-year-old Colony Churchman. She disappeared while running an errand in the city, her absence creating a void in a neighborhood that previously knew no fear. When she was discovered days later in the quiet town of Churchville, the initial shock was compounded by a detail that would define the decades to follow. Her name, Colony, shared the same first letter as the town where she was found. At the time, this was dismissed as a tragic coincidence, a quirk of geography in a sprawling county. 2 years later, in early 1973, the pattern hardened into a terrifying reality. 11-year-old Michelle Mainza vanished from a busy street corner when her body was discovered in the rural area of Macedon. The connection became impossible to ignore. Michelle from Macedon. The linguistic symmetry pointed to a perpetrator with a calculated, obsessive focus. By the time the third victim, Wanda Volkovich, was found in the town of Webster, the city was in a state of quiet paralysis. The alphabet murders had entered the national consciousness, haunting the dreams of parents and frustrating the best efforts of the New York State Police. The investigation was a monumental task of sifting through the lives of thousands. Because the crimes occurred across different town lines, the logistics of the search were immense, requiring a level of cooperation that stretched the technology of the day to its limit. Detectives looked for a man with a local connection, someone who knew the backroads of Monroe County as well as the urban grid of Rochester. They scrutinized teachers, neighbors, and strangers, looking for a break in the pattern or a witness who had seen a car parked in the tall grass of the rural delivery sites. But the alphabet killer left no fingerprints, no discarded evidence, and no digital footprint. Over the years, the case became a labyrinth of potential suspects. One man, a local firefighter with an unstable past, drew intense scrutiny. Yet he passed a polygraph and took his own secrets to the grave before a forensic link could be established. Decades later, with the advent of DNA profiling, investigators turned their hopes toward the physical evidence kept in long-term storage. In a turn that brought both resolution and a new layer of mystery, a high-profile suspect from a different state was ruled out through genetic testing, leaving the Rochester files as cold as the Lake Ontario wind. The legacy of the alphabet murders remains a somber weight on the community. The names Colony, Michelle, and Wanda are etched into the memory of Rochester, not just as victims, but as symbols of a lost innocence. The towns of Churchville, Macedon, and Webster carry on, their quiet streets eventually reclaiming their peace. Yet the symmetry of the crimes continues to baffle the modern mind. It is a story of a hidden obsession, a man who viewed his victims through a warped, alphabetic lens, and a city that spent half a century waiting for a truth that remains just out of reach. The industrial hum of Rochester has changed, the old factories repurposed, and the era of the 70s faded into history. But the files remain open, the black and white photographs of the era serving as silent witnesses to a time when a shadow moved through the suburbs. The investigation is a testament to the fact that while patterns can be identified, the darkness behind them is often much harder to decode. The streets are quiet now, and the alphabet remains just a series of letters, the mystery lingering in the cold, upstate air. Next story, the disappearance of Madeline McCann. Praia da Luz, Portugal, 2007. The southern coast of Portugal in the spring of 2007 was a landscape of stark, bright cliffs and a steady, rhythmic Atlantic breeze. In the village of Praia da Luz, the air carried a sharp, clean scent of salt spray and blooming bougainvillea, a fragrance that defined the slow, sun-drenched days of the Algarve. It was a place where the whitewashed buildings glowed with an amber intensity as the sun set over the ocean, creating a world that felt isolated from the rush of the modern world. The village was a sanctuary for families seeking the quiet comfort of the beach of light, where the cobblestone streets were narrow and the pace of life was dictated by the tide. In early May, the Ocean Club Resort was occupied by vacationers enjoying the pre-season calm, moved between the tranquil pools and the sprawling, sandy stretch of the village beach. On the evening of May 3rd, the atmosphere was one of typical vacation routine. 3-year-old Madeline McCann, a girl with bright eyes and a distinctive mark in her right iris, had spent the day in the sun and was asleep in the ground floor apartment her family had rented. Her younger siblings were in the room beside her. Just outside, in a dining area within sight of the patio doors, her parents and their friends were enjoying a quiet dinner, taking turns to check on the children at regular intervals. The night air was cool, and the sound of distant chatter from the resort's bar provided a soft soundtrack to the evening. At 9 p.m., a check revealed the children were sleeping peacefully. But at 10 p.m., The door to the apartment was found open. A heavy, cold draft moved through the room, and the silence of the village was broken by the realization that Madeline was no longer in her bed. The mystery began in the dark hours following that discovery. The initial search was conducted by the vacationers themselves, fanning out across the resort with flashlights that cut through the shadows of the palms. The silence of Praia de Luz was replaced by a frantic, collective calling of a name that would soon be known to the world. As the sun rose on May 4th, the investigation shifted to the local authorities, who began to comb the rugged terrain of the cliffs and the narrow alleyways of the old town. They looked through the quiet, gated villas and the dense scrubland that bordered the village, but the Portuguese sun offered no shadows that could explain a departure so sudden and absolute. The apartment itself became a site of forensic scrutiny, a quiet space where the bed was still warm, yet the child was gone. The investigative process was an exercise in intense international tension and linguistic barriers. Because the village was a hub for transit through the Algarve, detectives turned their focus to the thousands of vehicles that had moved through the region that night. They scrutinized the schedules of the yachts in the nearby marina of Lagos and the movement of travelers at the Faro airport. The forensic evidence was debated with a global intensity. Fragments of hair, microscopic fibers, and the scent traces picked up by specialized search dogs. Leads took investigators into the heart of Europe and beyond, looking for a silver vehicle or a stranger seen carrying a child through the village in the late hours. Yet, every lead was interpreted through a different lens, creating a narrative of contradictions that the local and British police struggled to reconcile. Over the following months, the search reached into the deepest corners of the international community. Millions of posters were distributed, and the image of Madeleine McCann became a landmark in the history of missing persons. The files of the case became a record of a tragedy that had occurred in a setting meant for safety, a story that focused on the vulnerability of the domestic space during a vacation. The geography of the search expanded to North Africa and the interior of Portugal, following sightings that promised a resolution, only for the silence to return as firmly as the evening fog. The investigation was hampered by the sheer scale of the media gaze, which turned the quiet village into a temporary center of the world, making the clinical recovery of evidence a monumental challenge. The search for Madeleine has been revisited by every major investigative agency, utilizing advancements in DNA, profiling, and digital tracking that didn't exist in 2007. The files remain open, a living registry of hundreds of thousands of hours of work. In recent years, the focus has shifted toward a specific individual identified by modern forensic linkages, reopening the investigation in the forests of Northern Europe. This new thread represents the persistence of the search, the refusal to let the silence of that May night remain absolute. Detectives continue to piece together a map of transit that existed 17 years ago, looking for the singular link that the 2000s could not find. Today, Praia de Luz has returned to its rhythmic, ancient cycle. The white buildings still glow in the afternoon sun, and the Atlantic breeze remains steady and cool. The apartment in the Ocean Club remains a part of the resort's footprint. Yet for those who know the history, the air near the patio doors carries a weight of unfinished business. The bougainvillea blooms every spring, and the DVD trees still lean toward the water. The mystery remains a testament to the fact that while patterns of travel can be traced, the truth of a single moment in the dark can remain as elusive as the horizon. The story continues in the quiet efforts of investigators who work across borders, sifting through the layers of the past. The names of the people involved have become part of a global narrative, yet the heart of the matter remains a quiet bed in a ground-floor apartment on a southern coast. As the evening settles over the Algarve, the cliffs stand in quiet vigil, watched over by a history that is yet to find its final word. The village sleeps with the knowledge that the Atlantic continues to roll in, timeless and steady, while the truth of 2007 waits for the light to finally reach it.